Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for making it here on what is a gross day outside with the mist and the cold. Um, we're going to go ahead and get started here. We do have some extra chairs up front. We can get more chairs if needed, but we're going to go ahead and get started with the program. My name is Joseph Houston, and as the director of the Lewiston Public Library, I would like to welcome you all to Great Falls Forum. The Forum is a monthly speaker series featuring leaders in the areas of business, public policy, academia, and the arts, and is a partnership of Bates College, the Sun Journal, and the Lewiston Public Library. This year marks the 27th season of Great Falls Forum. We thank you for your support and ensuring the program's continued success. Today's program is also streaming live via Zoom, and a recording will be available on the library's YouTube page. Please visit lplonline.org for more information. Also, please mark your calendars for our next Great Falls Forum on April 24th with author Monica Wood. At the conclusion of today's program, there will be an opportunity for audience questions. Those in the room are welcome to raise their hands, and those joining us virtually can enter their questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll read these to our speakers. And now I have the pleasure of introducing today's featured speakers, Maulian Bryant and Joseph Hall. I do have some biographical information to read through here, and we have some very accomplished guests, so it might take me a moment, so bear with me. Maulian Bryant was named Executive Director of the Wabanaki Alliance in December of 2024. She's been with the Alliance since its founding in 2020, serving for 4 years as President of the Wabanaki Alliance Board. Bryant served as the first Penobscot Nation tribal ambassador from 2017 to 2024, having been appointed by Penobscot Nation Chief Kirk Francis. As ambassador, Bryant acted as a representative of the Penobscot Nation and liaison for the nation at the local, state, and federal levels of government in order to educate and advocate for policy and laws that impact and protect Penobscot Nation's sovereignty, culture, natural resources, and general welfare. Prior to her work as ambassador, Bryant served as an elected member of the Penobscot Nation Tribal Council. She grew up on Indian Island with the Penobscot Nation Reservation and is the daughter of former Penobscot Nation Chief Barry Dana, who served from 2000 to 2004. Bryant graduated from University of Maine in Orono with a degree in political science. In 2022, Colby College presented her with an honorary doctorate for her work on equity issues and policy. Bryant is an outspoken advocate on the issue of derogatory mascots and imagery. Her advocacy resulted in the state of Maine enacting laws that changed the annual Columbus Day in October to Indigenous Peoples Day and prohibited public schools from using derogatory mascots. Her other passion is finding ways to strengthen and expand programs that help preserve and teach the customs and traditions of the Penobscot people. She's a loving mother to 3 daughters and centers them in much of her work, making the state and country a safer and more equitable place for her children and all tribal people. She believes in leading with love and making progress by finding shared humanity. Joseph Hall teaches courses about colonial North America, United States War for Independence, environmental history, and Native American history. His favorite class is a short-term course on the history of Wabanakis, the collective term for Penobscots, Passamaquoddies, Mi'kmaqs, and Malisets of Maine, but also New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and eastern Quebec. Professor Hall's principal scholarly interests focus on Native American interactions with Europeans during the colonial period. He has written a book exploring how European and Native American understandings of trade and gift giving shaped the history of the Southeast between 1350 and 1740. But more recently, his interests have shifted north. He is currently developing a research project around the question of how Wabanakis cultivated their ties to their homelands, even as European American colonists dispossessed them of most of that territory. It is inspired by a long-standing curiosity about the contemporary place of our colonial past and a developing desire to collaborate with Wabanaki historians on questions of common interest. Please join me in welcoming Maulian and Joseph to Lewiston.
Do you want to start?
You can start.
I can start. Okay, so what a delight to see so many people here on a drizzly, dreary Thursday. Thank you all very much for coming. I hope I'm not feedbacking too much. We're good? Okay. So I just want to add that a lot of the work that I do in terms of Wabanaki studies is work that I do as best I can in partnership with Wabanaki. So it's really, I think, fantastic that the organizers of this event were able to put me in conversation with, pair me with somebody as distinguished as Maulian Bryant. So I'm really grateful for that. As one of my friends, I hope I could say, but also one of my partners, James Francis, who's the Penobscot tribal historian, has said, nothing about us without us. And I think that's a really important thing to be able to say, in part because a lot of people like me, which is to say white, raised by, I would say, very good, careful, loving, liberal parents, will often want to know a great deal about Native peoples and will often, in particular, want to make a career out of learning about Native peoples without necessarily engaging with those communities and often doing it more for their own self-benefit than for the communities. And I will say, I do have a job because of Wabanaki, and that does mean that I actually am a beneficiary of the things that I know, but I'm able to do it, or I hope I can do it as much as I can in partnership with Wabanaki. Plenty of my, shall we say, predecessors have not. We were brought here as sort of Wabanaki then and now, so I'm the historian, so I guess I'm the then. But I think it would be helpful just to elaborate a little on what Joey just said in terms of who Wabanaki are. And then I can talk a little about then. And I'm also really curious to hear how Maulian would talk about then and now as well. So Wabanaki is a term that collectively means people of the Dawnland. A Passamaquoddy language teacher, Roger Paul, has said that the word comes from the Passamaquoddy word, or is at least related to the Passamaquoddy word, Wabanakis, which is the place, so the people of the place where the sun first shows their face. And I think it's useful to know language in part because I think you all speak more native language than you realize, or you know more native languages than you think. Not that you're linguists or anything like that. But if you have heard of Wampanoag, which is to say the people who met the Pilgrims in 1620, then you know of another people of the Dawnland, because Waban is white. So in other words, the place of whiteness, the place where the sun first whitens or lightens the horizon, is a word that you've actually heard in more than one place, one of them being here and one of them being there. And I just want to mention that in part because I think we think of words like Wabanakis or Androscoggin or Kennebec as just these isolated kind of weird collections of syllables. They're part of a larger logic, and we actually all inhabit that logic. And it's interesting when you start paying attention how much of that logic is still there. So Wabanaki is a collective term for the people of the Dawnland. It includes, as Joey mentioned, the peoples of the region that stretches roughly from what's now Nova Scotia in the east, including Cape Breton Island, southern Quebec, northern New England, all the way west to Lake Champlain, roughly. And it includes, as he mentioned, the Penobscots, the Passamaquoddy, the Mi'kmaq, and the Maliseets. You've probably seen Mi'kmaq spelled M-I-C-M-A-C, so many people pronounce it Micmac. And the Mi'kmaq Nation has actually asked that you pronounce it the way the language pronounces it, which is Mi'kmaq. In addition to those four nations that are situated in Maine, the Passamaquoddy, the Mi'kmaq, and the Wolastoqiyik, or the Maliseet, all also have communities, nations in maritime Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. And in addition, there's a group known as Abenaki who have a tribal community, a nation in, now I'm blanking, Odanak and Wolanak, both of which are in southern Canada, west of Quebec City and east of Montreal. So in other words, there are a number of Native peoples who all collectively know of themselves as Wabanaki. And when I think about Wabanaki, particularly in terms of the then and now, I'm usually thinking mostly about the region that I know best, which is what's now Maine. But it's definitely not exclusively that. I don't know if there's anything you'd want to add.
Just great to be here with you all and great to be in conversation with you. We've worked together a few different times. This is a wonderful way to catch up. And it's such a lovely introduction and setting up of this talk. I think you'll find that along with this historical context for, I will knock this over at some point, just giving you all a heads up. This historical context of just how widespread the Wabanaki influence and presence is throughout our homeland. There's really a lot of threads that come right through till today. So we'll talk about those cultural ties, those values that have really persevered against all odds in conjunction with this fight for our tribal sovereignty and a lot of our rights and equality that I've been blessed to get to be a part of. So I think this will be a nice natural flow between the two.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm glad you said that too in terms of threads, because I think so I'm a historian, and actually most of my interest in history is focused in like the 1600s and 1700s, which is old stuff, unless you're Wabanaki, in which case it's just the last like 300 years of the 12,000 year long timeline. I once had, so Maria Gerard, another Penobscot educator, once put a timeline across like 3 blackboards in the classroom that I was in at Bates. And I mean, think about it. If you have a 12,000 year long timeline and each 1,000 years is 1 foot, then you have a 12-foot timeline. And if you're going to do the last 400 years that I'm supposedly mostly interested in, you're talking a little less than 6 inches of that 12-foot timeline. So anyway, so I'm interested in old stuff, again, unless you're Wabanaki, then it's more recent. But but one of the things that happens a lot when people ask me about Wabanaki history or just history is they're kind of asking a question that's kind of like, can you tell me about them then before we now got here? With the them being Wabanaki and the we being non-native people, usually implicitly white, but not necessarily. And it's really important. One of the things that's really important for me is, especially as a resident of Maine, where I have been now for 22 years, is to think about it in terms of, well, how is Wabanaki history still history? Like in the present, like making history, how are things still happening? And how is understanding the history of today actually connected to the history of the past? Why does it matter to know 300 years ago when we're talking about today? And so let me offer just a couple of thoughts that are rooted here, that is to say Lewiston, Auburn. I don't know if all of you are sort of local, but at the very least I can gesture to things that are kind of local-ish. So for instance, if you want to talk, again, long amounts of time, you could go to Auburn-Lewiston Airport, like 3-4 miles southwest of here, and you will be near a phenomenal caribou hunting site from 10,000 years ago. And I've heard about this because in the course of developing the airport and the course of other work, archaeological sort of excavations were done that found caribou hunting tools, large settlement sites for the purposes of caribou hunting. And what's great about the airport is that because it's this large, wide open space, you can actually see there is a plateau that's above the plateau of the cleared space of the airport. And while, of course, the airport was leveled, it wasn't all that totally flat. You get a sense of how, if you are a hunter in a tundra, which is what it would have been 10,000 years ago, you have a great spot to watch herds move through the area without necessarily being in their way or scaring them off or whatever. So in other words, when you go by the airport, next time you do that, consider that you're going by an excellent hunting site that has been there since just after the ice melted from these areas. And it's worth thinking about that in a different way. So a little less than 10,000 years ago, after the ice melts, you've got sea level rise. And there was a period around here where 12,000 years ago, this would have probably been water, salt water. And if any of you have ever tried to garden in this area and you hit that really nasty clay, like it's deep, it's thick, and it's going to kill your tomatoes. And the thing is that clay is marine clay. And the reason why that's all worth thinking about, tundras and then the marine clay that preceded them, is because there were people here to see that. And their descendants are here today. And it's worth considering what it means to be among descendants of people who have learned to live in a place that has been coastline, that has been tundra, that has been boreal forest, that has been deciduous forest, that has been superhighways. All of those things are part of a place that Wabanaki have learned to make. And it's worth remembering that they have done that over millennia, over generations and generations. And in a state where people are so proud when they can say, I'm a 7th generation Mainer, it's often worth asking what it means to be, I don't know what the math is when you divide 12,000 by 30, but you get the point. So, so there's that, but then there's this other piece too, which I think is easy to forget. And I think the whole reason that we're here, like literally in this room, you could even say, but in a place, there are all of these brick buildings on a street that's on this grid that's right down the street from, the giant brick building that's right, like you can look out those windows and see the textile mills. The whole reason there are human beings that like to cluster here is because, I'm going to gesture that way, to the waterfalls that have been there for as long as there has been water flowing from the glaciers that melted. And as long as those waters have been flowing down this river channel and over those falls, well, not quite as long, but at least around 6,000 years, there have been salmon looking for ways to get up those falls, to spawn in the upper tributaries where they can do that safely and where their little kids can grow up without having to be eaten by sharks, basically. And what that means is that the place to catch and dry fish by the falls, Amit Ganpantuk, has been an important place for as long as salmon have been running and people have been eating salmon. And what that means too is that we're in a place that has been important to people for millennia. And it was only 100 and change years ago when an industrialist like Benjamin Bates, he wasn't the first, but he was the first to do it best, looked at those falls and said, I have a different idea. And my idea is, instead of using the energy of those falls to test the fish who I can eat, I'm going to use the energy of those falls to run over my water wheels so I can spin some textile mills and turn the cotton that enslaved people in the South are growing into cloth. So the falls are here, and as a result, people are here. And when I think about why Wabanaki history matters in that story, it's important to ask, I think, two things. And the first is, why did Wabanaki stop saying who could use the falls for what? And that's not a pretty story. There's a story of violence. There was a town across the river at Amit Ganpantuk, right roughly where the Little Androscoggin meets the Androscoggin River, more or less if you're taking the railroad pedestrian bridge across the river. Right there on the left in a place called Laurel Hill, not far from New Auburn. That town was destroyed in 1690 because colonists felt like it was time to drive Wabanaki away from here, because they had different visions for this landscape. Not textile mills yet, but that was coming. In other words, for a place like Bates, or a person like Bates, to make a place like Lewiston into a textile mill like it is, and for that matter, to make a college like Bates College, takes violence. And it takes displacement. It takes horror. And that's not pretty. But then again, if we want to understand our relationships, we can't always look at the pretty stuff. And I would say that especially to all of you who are in long-term relationships. I think you know that as well as anybody, that the relationship's going to suck if you only try to talk about the good things. And it's definitely not going to last long if you never talk about the bad things. But there were two things that I wanted to say that are important about recognizing Wabanaki presence. And the first is that sometimes violence happened because colonial peoples had a different vision and they were not willing to share that vision or to negotiate that vision. But there's a second thing that's important too, and that's that Wabanaki didn't disappear from Amit Ganpantuk. In the middle 1800s, there were Wabanaki traveling this river, stopping at that site cross the river near where Amigonpungtuk, the town, used to be, on their way to and from Canada, on their way to Brunswick, where they would gather blueberries, where you can still gather blueberries, and where some Wabanaki still do gather blueberries, and clams at McCoy. And that was all the way through the 1800s. And so this idea that Wabanaki disappear is an important additional fiction. So there are Wabanaki continuing to relate to a place. But there's another piece to this that I find really interesting. I know the word Amigonpungtuk because there's a book collected by a woman named Fanny Hardy Ekstrom of Wabanaki place names of the coast and the Penobscot Valley. I don't know if you know this, but when she was gathering her material, and she was from the Brewer and Bangor area, she talked a lot with Penobscots, and it was Penobscots in the 1930s who told her the name Amigonpungtuk. That Penobscots in the 1930s remembered that this was the place to catch and dry fish at the falls. And that to me is an extraordinary act of remembrance and connection to a place that by then was already toxic. We were not drinking the water from the river in the 1930s. Here, wait, let me do that. Happens? I'm back on. Okay. I lost my train of thought, but I think the point is this. Still remembering gathering and drying fish. In other words, these are places that still have relationships to people who are still here, period. And these relationships didn't end in the 1930s either. And so as a historian, I love to talk about Wabanaki history, but I think the most important thing that I do when I'm talking about Wabanaki past is insisting on Wabanaki presence. I'm there. I'm good. I'm not going to fight this anymore.
Sure. So hopefully mine stays behaving. So what a wonderful setup to get into kind of the meat and potatoes of what we're working on now. And I think I got started as a very young person getting activated to look at tribal issues through a couple different lenses. It was mentioned that I got really into this fight against Indian mascots and sort of these harmful racial stereotypes. And that wasn't just kind of alone or a separate battle I was going through. It was very much tied into what I was watching my father, Barry Dana, go through as tribal chief. He was embroiled in a lawsuit in the early 2000s. The Penobscot Nation and Passamaquoddy tribe were being sued effectively by Great Northern Paper. And you can look that up, and I won't bore you all with all the legal details, but the outcomes of these litigations just felt so unjust all the time. You know, there were petitions for internal tribal documents and meeting minutes and you know, things that we felt were sacred to our people. You know, we don't open up our tribal council meetings to everyone. So we definitely don't want to turn those minutes over to paper mills who want to chip away at water quality standards. So when we kept losing a lot of these lawsuits, and I dug a little deeper, even as a young person, learning about this 1980 Maine Indian Land Claim Settlement Act, that is, we'll come back to in a moment, it's the basis of a lot of the work we do today. So much of this was about land and territory and how we're measuring value and resources and wealth and a lot of this violence that we hear about. This was because of the colonial powers wanting all that Wabanaki territory. And this went along with my sort of visceral reaction to these Indian mascots because it felt like, okay, it wasn't safe for us to be a people back then. We were taken advantage of, and our land was stolen, and then our children were stolen, our religion was outlawed. But yet now people want to slap on a costume and play us on a basketball court. So this kind of always bubbling inequity over tribal sovereignty really informed my feelings, I think, about these Indian mascots. I think sometimes people see them as different things, but it's all about that power and who has it and who's benefiting from it and who's not. So on my little journey, fighting all these good fights, I was so fortunate to have really great mentors who, I think as a young person, when you first get angry about things, that can really go either way. When you're a marginalized or vulnerable population, that could really go either way. It's kind of extra tough to find people sometimes to guide those very human feelings that at that age you're not mature enough to really sort through and develop in a healthy way all the time. So I'm so glad I had people in my family that were in tribal leadership and not just the chiefs and the tribal representative, my great aunt Donna Loring, but also my mother, who's a school teacher, my grandmother, who's a tribal clerk, my other grandmother on tribal council. These real unsung heroes of our community guided me through a lot of this too. And I want to talk in a full way about this battle about tribal sovereignty because it's so much of what the now is for Wabanaki people. And I've been really fortunate to be able to have leadership positions, serving as the ambassador of the Penobscot Nation, which came about because we had pulled our legislative representative. So that's a whole story that could take the full hour, but essentially it didn't feel like an equitable or good relationship with the state of Maine. I don't know that it does now, but I think it's getting better. And we started the Wabanaki Alliance when the tribes came together around 2020, and we don't all agree on everything. We don't all have the same goals or vision, but we do believe in restoring the recognition of our tribal sovereignty. And that felt like a good touch point to work together on. And we've grown this beautiful coalition that shows up time and time again and helps us work through this. So the real crux of this problem goes back to this land taking and the state of Maine asserting itself over so much Wabanaki land and doing so illegally. So back in the 1970s, the Passamaquoddy tribe were the first ones to figure out that roughly 2/3 of the state of Maine was illegally taken from the tribes. Those treaties overseeing a lot of that taking were never ratified by the federal government. So a lawsuit ensued. There were acts of Congress. There was federal recognition that had happened a couple years before. So you have these tribes sort of ready to fight the fight, but not equipped all that well, dealing with centuries of harm and trauma, and now thrust into this lawsuit and really pressured to settle it somehow. The state of Maine, who is clearly the party in the wrong, did a great job negotiating this for themselves. The settlement included funds set aside for the tribes to sort of account for this taking of the land. So the tribes have land acquisition funds and ability to buy back land from the federal government to put in trust. But the state of Maine was also very insistent on language that refers to the tribes as having the rights of municipalities. And there's further language in this settlement that strips away our access to federal Indian law. And I should say, a lot of us don't use the word Indian to describe ourselves, but talking about laws, often that's what they're called. So there's this bulk of policy in the federal government called federal Indian law, and any law passed since 1980 meant to benefit federally recognized tribes, which we haven't had access to because of this settlement and the language therein. So I never want it to seem like I begrudged those tribal leaders in 1980 or that I thought this was a bad deal or that I think we need to come in and fix it. I think they made the best choice they could have at the time. And thinking about, back to the 1700s, there were actual proclamations from colonial governments that put bounties on the scalps of Wabanaki people. So this was authorized by the government and the crown, and they would tell settlers to go out and hunt down. There's various proclamations. There's one specifically to Penobscot, and it sets prices for the scalps of men, women, and children. When you bring them into like a trading post, you get paid for them. So you come out of this, at first you have at the time of contact, these diseases that we don't have immunity to. There was once about 26 different distinct Wabanaki nations in this area we call Maine, and now there's 5 with the Abenaki. And so then you have this era of the bounties. Then you have this land theft. Then you have, taking of the children and putting into boarding schools to assimilate, and then the state foster care system. So by the time you get to the 1970s, the tribes are in some real dire conditions. And the promise of something rather than nothing probably, it felt like very big stakes, I think. And there was also the factor of President Jimmy Carter was very open to helping and signing a settlement. And the writing was on the wall that Ronald Reagan would be taking over, and he was not very open to these sorts of things. So you had tribal leaders being told, look, this probably won't be a problem. If you agree to this, you'll get some land back, you'll get some money, and you'll help your people. And if you don't, you might get nothing. So what we're left with is a flawed settlement that we've been working really hard to fix, and we have made some great progress on it. And the Wabanaki Alliance has been just a great collection of people. It always blows me away. We're a very small part of the population of Maine. I think we're less than 2% of the tribal people, but the people that show up to these public hearings on these bills and the people that care about these issues, we've just come such a long way from those days when I was a teenager, feeling frustration at these basketball games and watching these court proceedings and knowing something is very, very wrong. And I don't think I ever could have thought that we would engage so much fire and spirit amongst Mainers to really care about these things.
I think it's still safe to talk, but what I was kind of thinking might be good is if you talked a little more about what some of those projects are that you're working on with the Wabanaki Alliance.
Absolutely. So I never want to put us squarely in a policy space because there's a lot of other things going on. But learning about these bills, I think, is really important. So back in 2019, the state legislature, we had a lot of friends in there that were coming to the tribes and knew that this settlement from 1980 was really the problem, right? If we want to heal this tribal state relationship, that we need to be looking at that and thinking about tribal sovereignty in a new, bold way. So you had lawmakers putting in bills like repeal the whole thing or replace it with this or really strip it away and make all these amendments. And former Speaker Sarah Gideon and former Senate President Troy Jackson pulled all of the tribal leaders together and basically said, what do you all want to do? We had chiefs and vice chiefs, ambassadors, representatives, and the outcome of that was this task force that met six or so times, and this was tribal leaders, it was state lawmakers, there were non-voting folks from the Attorney General's office and Governor's office and the Maine Indian Tribal State Commission, and these people all got together and they studied federal Indian law, they studied the Settlement Act, and they talked about ways to amend this and make things better for the Wabanaki people in Maine. And those 22 consensus recommendations have taken the form of a few different pieces of legislation over the past 4 or 5 years or so. And we've been talking about this in our communications team with Wabanaki Alliance. We just throw out task force, like people know what it is, but we've been at this a while and it's kind of a long time ago now. So we're starting to refresh folks on these recommendations. So there have been a few that have been kind of in the news a little bit. We've had some large omnibus pieces of legislation with a lot of amendments to that 1980 Act. And Governor Mills has worked with us really well on some things, and she's been extremely resistant to those larger pieces of legislation, as well as sweeping efforts to have the Wabanaki tribes gain access to federal Indian law in a complete way. She's vetoed bills of that nature. So those are two big things we haven't gotten over the finish line that we're still working on. We've been able to attack in small ways some of the other pieces of this, and it was cool. I was very fresh at being the ambassador and worked with my friend Ben Collings from Portland to put in the mascot bill and the Indigenous Peoples Day bill. And after I was appointed, he kind of called me and said, well, do you want to work on mascots or do you want to change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day? And I said, yes. He said, okay, and this is why we're friends. So having those over the finish line really set the stage for a good conversation about, a lot of people didn't even know there was Wabanaki tribes still here. I think a lot of times having those mascots around, it made people think, well, that's a people of the past, or it puts us in a separate category, I think, and kind of puts us in a box and doesn't allow us to be fully seen as the present people we are. So when we got to these issues of tribal sovereignty and sort of this policy work, a lot of the conversations around those two bills I found very useful, even if they were extremely unpleasant. At least it's helpful to know where people are at. So some of the successes we've gotten through, there's one particular piece of federal legislation that it had been a real problem that the tribes didn't have access to it, and that's the Violence Against Women Act. So prior to 2013 and that reauthorization at the federal level, the tribes throughout the country, there were issues with jurisdiction when you had a domestic violence situation and the perpetrator was not a tribal member. You couldn't take those cases in tribal courts. And if you're familiar at all with the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis, this has a lot to do with it. It has this kind of history of jurisdictional issues and not knowing where to put these cases. So when that law was passed, the way the Settlement Act behaves is tribes can attempt or think we can take part in some of these federal laws that don't appear to impact state jurisdiction, but the state can step in at any time and say, no, it does impact us, so stop. So the Violence Against Women Act, the Penobscot Nation Tribal Court was ramping up to take these cases. We were chosen for a nationwide pilot program to start, showcasing how tribal courts handle VAWA cases. And then the Attorney General, Janet Mills, who of course is now the governor, she stepped in for the state of Maine and blocked us from having access to that. So in a cool sort of cycle of life, Governor Mills as governor worked with us on bringing the VAWA statute into reality in Maine law. And that took start to finish, getting, blocked from this into signing it into state law took 7 years. And that was through now Senator Rachel Talbot Ross, former speaker. She had that bill in for us. And that was a heavy lift. It was a lot of convincing the state that our tribal courts could handle this, that perpetrators would get a fair trial and fair punishment. And sometimes as a human being, that's hard. Sitting in the Judiciary Committee, hearing lawmakers have so much more compassion and space and care for potential domestic violence offenders than they do for all of these Indigenous people, mostly women, that have been harmed over the decades from not having access to these cases. So a lot of times it's that push and pull of, I have in my bio, leading with love and finding shared humanity. I don't mean that as this kumbaya, we all hold hands and sing songs. That's a really hard thing to do, is remember to have that empathy for other people when you don't understand where they're coming from or how they can't see where you are and in your humanity. So thankfully, we got that law passed in state statute, and we were mentioned in the federal bill. There's another thing we can do. If we get all of our federal delegation on board, we can be mentioned in federal legislation and have access to it. And that's very hard to do, to get them all to agree to add us to things. So where we're at now is we would like to have access to all federal beneficial laws, and we have a new bill in that will be taken up next year. And we've had this large effort to sort of pass all these sweeping changes that has failed, but we've been able to negotiate smaller bills. So we've restored some taxation provision to our communities. We've restored more criminal jurisdiction to our tribal courts in addition to VAWA. And that's important. We actually commissioned a report from Harvard University to look at, does the Settlement Act from 1980 hold back our communities in an economic way? And what does that do to not just us, but surrounding communities? So that report's on our website, and it basically said what we thought it would say, that not having access to all these resources and rights as tribes does hold us back. And if we were kind of able to fully recognize and realize those rights, we could lift up surrounding communities. And the tribal communities, if you don't know, the Passamaquoddy are over in Washington County. They have 2 communities one near Eastport, one near, one's in Indian Township, sort of near Lincoln. And then in Aroostook County is the Mi'kmaq and the Maliseet. So these are places that could use some economic love. So that Harvard report's on our website. So, and we negotiated a piece of gaming around online sports betting. So gaming is always a tricky thing. We've run it as its own bill, even though it was in that larger omnibus piece or recommendations, it hasn't been in the omnibus bill. And we did almost get a bill through to sort of have the tribes have access to the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which I think the stereotype is tribes, when they access this federal law, can just go out and put a casino on every corner and can just build, slot machines everywhere they go. You just leave a trail of them. But it's really not like that. It's actually a restrictive act, and it allows the tribes to negotiate compacts with state government around gaming. So it's actually more of a process law than a carte blanche, like here, go do whatever you want. So when the governor vetoed that bill, which we had got through the House and the Senate and to her desk, she offered to negotiate something around gaming with us. And that's where you see the access to the online sports betting revenue. Also, what I'll end on is there is a human rights crisis really happening at the Sabayak Passamaquoddy Reservation over near Eastport, and they don't have clean drinking water, and they haven't for quite some time, decades, but I don't know if they ever have, honestly. So former Representative Rena Newell brought up a bill a couple of sessions ago, and it seeks to amend the Settlement Act. Part of the problem with their water is they need to drill a new well and haven't been able to put land into trust where they need this well, because part of the Settlement Act is Eastport has veto power over that land into trust application. So that's a difference with tribes in Maine versus tribes otherwhere, that's not part of sort of the rest of the country. So we did get that bill passed and the governor signed it. So they're on their way to hopefully fixing this crisis, but they need a whole lot of support. And now they're raising funds to make all these changes and try to get clean water. But that was maybe one of the biggest, it feels like a victory because we passed the law, but they still don't have clean drinking water. So like shining a light on that whenever I can. But yeah, the Wabanaki Alliance is sort of where a lot of this work is happening, and all of our board and advisory board is past or present tribal leaders, and WabanakiAlliance.com has a bill tracker and history and who we all are if anyone's interested.
I think just before we go to questions, I want to say for Maulian to say something like leading with love is a practice and it's hard. I think you kind of undersell the challenge, and that's you're very diplomatic. And I just want to point out, for those of you who have been in the state for 20 years, that when the major casino referendum came forward in 2003, there were two proposals for gambling in the state at the time. One of them was to allow slot machines at racinos, and the other one was to allow Passamaquoddies and Penobscots to establish basically the provisions of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. And the Penobscot Passamaquoddy provision or proposal as a referendum failed 2-1, 66-33. The Racino proposal passed 55-45. And so if you've ever wondered if most of Maine, or at the very least much of Maine, I don't want to presume, has a strong antipathy to Wabanaki sovereignty, you might want to remember that and what it takes to lead with love in that kind of an environment, which of course has changed in 22 years, but that kind of change didn't happen because a lot of white Mainers thought, oh, wait. So I just want to point that out. Like, there's a lot that happens in the state right now that's hard work for people like Molly. But I think we're at a point where maybe it's worth asking if you all have questions.
Yeah, we've got about 15 minutes here, so I will try to circulate with this mic. We got a nice full room, so I'll have to take the scenic route a couple of times here.
Thank you. Hello. Oh, yes. Thank you so much for being here. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to meet before this talk. My name is Carl Schleen. I'm the mayor of Lewiston, and really appreciate hearing you today. I grew up in Arizona, a small town which was right next to a Yavapai Apache Nation reservation land. And unfortunately, I grew up hearing tired stereotypes that unfortunately still exist today. Fast forward to now, I've lived in Maine, I don't know, going on like 14 years or so. And where you mentioned high school mascots, and recently Skowhegan changed their mascot. And I remember at the time, this was before I was mayor, the amount of vitriol that was coming from people in Skowhegan. And I was surprised because I thought as society we were at a different place, but apparently not. Were you surprised by this? That's one question. And then was there work being done by nations behind the scenes to move this along? And just your overall thoughts on that.
Oh, absolutely. And it's my fault we didn't meet before. I got in this room at 11:56. So, so the battle in Skowhegan, that had gone on for many, many years, and I get a lot of the attention and credit for that. And I lovingly accept that. Like, thank you. But also, I'm just one person in so many people that were moving this work forward. And I always think I'm so lucky that I came into this work at a time where I could be heard, and I am invited to things, and people do hear what I say and want to hear what I say. And that's such a gift. I look at my grandmother, who is 86. Our people didn't get the right to vote in state elections until 1967. So she was born in 1938. Do you think I'm 40, do you think when she was 40, anybody was inviting her to nice big rooms to hear her thoughts? No. So I feel so blessed and honored, and I really stand on the shoulders of all those people who put in so much work. And Skowhegan in particular, they were targeted by the national group American Indian Movement in 2001 for some of their like over-the-top displays at this mascot tree. So then they put out a community survey. The community said, no, we're fine with it. So, but they point to that survey a lot, like that they were, okay, because they did that survey. So then a lot of people kept working at it. The Maine People's Alliance and different folks involved there were working on it. A lot of allies, a lot of tribal leaders, and it really came to a head around 2015, where we were going to the school board meetings. They had kind of put in place a new arm of their school board to meet with us and hear our concerns. And that's when you got this pushback protest within the town, the Skowhegan Indian Pride group that formed. And so going into those meetings, it was scary sometimes. I have young children, well, now they're old, and I have one young one. But back then, my older two were very young, and I wouldn't bring them over there with me. And I brought them to most everything I did. I always like having them with me, but I didn't feel safe. I got really nasty threats to me personally and talking to my family. And at the end of one meeting, a school board member came up to me and sort of put his finger in my face, and he said, I'm just as Indian as you are, and Skowhegan is my tribe. So when you have a moment like that, you got to think like, this is about so much more than these sports games or these pictures on the walls or these jerseys. Like this is about human identity. And while that was a really ugly moment, it's something I'll always remember. And it taught me a lot about how to successfully make change happen. And you don't walk into a place saying, I'm right and you're wrong, even if you are. Because that shuts people down, and that makes people really double down on their shame and defensiveness. And so I remember that moment as this turning point of like, oh, this is more than what we're doing. This is about the psychology. And so when you look at it in that realm and reframe it as like, yes, you're very tied to this, that doesn't necessarily make you racist. Maybe you act racist because of it, but it makes you proud of your town and your people and your family. And we can understand that. I understand how to be proud of my culture, my people, my family. So as yucky as that felt, I think it led to a real personal development for me. It's like, oh, this is how we make this change. And it helps when thinking about some of these outwardly racist sometimes scary and unsafe situations when you're thinking like these are scared human beings and they're acting out of anger because they're afraid you're taking something from them. So working through some of that human stuff, I think, is how we eventually, over 5 years or so, was able to get that change. And we did pass the law at the state level, but Skowhegan had changed by themselves, I think, 2 months before we passed the law. So it was really nice to not have to enforce that law, right? We passed it. It's a beautiful thing to do. It's a good backstop, but we did get everyone there on their own, which is great. Yeah, thank you.
Anyone else have a question? Right here.
I heard you say that if you could get our federal delegation on the same page, you could move forward, which sounds to me like herding cats. I'd like to hear some specifics and some names.
Sure. So we have varying degrees of relationships with the federal delegation on varying topics. I don't want to rank them, but Representative Pingree is a ranking member on House Appropriations Committee. I've testified before her committee many times about items in the budget and tribal programming. So her committee will oversee guidance on things like the Environmental Protection Agency, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Indian Health Services. She's been a lovely, wonderful partner. She doesn't have tribes in her district, but she works with us and is a great advocate when she can be. Representative Jared Golden, he has also been lovely with us. I don't know why. He doesn't need to be. He makes some strong choices around his politics. I think that's safe to say. But he's been a really steadfast ally for the tribes. He actually introduced the Equality for Wabanaki Nations Act that would grant us access to federal Indian law. And he wanted to go really bold and really strong with it and make it retroactive to 1980. This is inside baseball, but we heard rumblings when we were crafting this bill with him that Senator King may not champion this legislation, but might be okay with it if we made it prospective. So we softened the bill to hopefully get Senator King on board. And we got that bill through the House. Representative Golden attached it to a couple different vehicles, and we succeeded in those votes. And then Senator King, behind the scenes, made sure it didn't get a Senate vote. So he didn't come out and publicly oppose it, but we have a very large, lovely, active coalition that demands answers when needed. And they wrote him a whole lot of letters, and his response to them was very much like we hear from Governor Mills in her veto letters. This is too much too soon. These broad changes will make things confusing. They often point to this idea of like tribal land is in a patchwork with state land. So if there's different laws and jurisdictions, people will be confused or not know what law applies where. We believe very firmly we can work through that. And if you look at a map, we have a map on WabanakiAlliance.com of where tribal lands are and where these laws might take effect, that these laws wouldn't be that different. We have a very, very small land holding in the state. So that's where Senator King has been. He's been open to meeting with us all the time. I've met with him several times. He actually came to Penobscot Nation and had a very nice ceremony with one of our treasured veterans, Charles Shea, who is a decorated veteran that served as a medic in D-Day, and just that was a lovely interaction, and he presented him with the flag. So again, that human level, we connect sometimes. Policy, it hasn't gone great with Senator King. And then Senator Collins, she always champions kind of the normal thing she does. So there's a program called Special Diabetes Funding for American Indians, and she makes sure that gets through and likes to tell us about that. The best we can hope from her and other things is she kind of stays away from it and doesn't outwardly oppose it. So it probably is, as you imagine, where the federal delegation is at. And I will say that I've never felt shut out or disrespected by any of them. When they do have concerns, the meetings I've been in, we talk about it.
We are getting close on time here, and I actually want to note something and ask a question myself. So sorry, I'm executing some executive privilege here. First of all, you mentioned being invited to a large room of people. This is, in my time here, the largest turnout we have had for an adult program of any kind. So
Awesome.
just
Yeah.
and so that speaks to my question, which is basically there is an appetite among us to get more information about, how we can be informed on the issues that are affecting Indigenous people and how we can pressure our representatives to support those. And so what is your advice on how we can stay up to date with sort of the stuff that you're working on and the things that are important for us all to be educated about?
Great question, and my favorite question. So Wabanaki Alliance has really breathed so much new life into a lot of this work. And we started with this really grassroots coalition of faith groups and environmental organizations and maybe 10 or so folks meeting with tribal leaders on our board. And now we have over 300 organizations have officially signed on as supporters. We have a very, very large email list. You can sign up on the website to be on the email list. At the very least, you'll get notified of what we're doing. And then we also have this working group. We're not a membership organization, but we do maintain this coalition of about 100, 150 folks that show up to biweekly calls, mostly representing the organizations and a few individuals. And that group has split into teams of the communications team, the field team, the coalition building team, the State House lobbying team, and we have a new fundraising team. And between all of those awesome volunteers and myself and my associate director, we're kind of doing our best to keep the trains running on time. And there's a lot of different ways, whatever you're showing up with time, talents, energy, we would love to involve you however you'd like.
And I'll just add to that in terms of other information, especially broader. The Abbey Museum has an excellent set of resources as it relates to Wabanaki studies. And Abbey is spelled A-B-B-E. It's in Bar Harbor. If you've never been, highly, highly recommend it. If you're interested in more local issues, pay attention to what's going on with the Maine Mill. That is the Museum of Industry, Labor, and Learning. There are a group of us who are working there to highlight more Wabanaki history in this area as well. And so that's very much in its preliminary stages, but as the new museum opens in the next year and a half or two, that's a part of that work. So there are ways to do these things that are local as well as, if you will, state level.
Yeah, absolutely. And Joe had a great intro about place names. I'll give a recommendation. Maine Calling this week featured James Francis from Penobscot Nation, and just a really great hour talking through a lot of those place names. It's a great listen.
All right, and with that, our time is up. Everyone, please, a round of applause for Maulian and Joe.